I went to the Appalachian Trail by myself. I booked a cabin there for a week and stayed there. I went with all the essentials, an internet device, the most important one to get updates about camping stuff via socials, snacks, and food, a pistol and knife, and other necessary items. The first 2 days were awesome. Yet, on the third day, I started feeling something weird, especially after sunset. I began doubting myself, wondering if I had done the right thing by coming there. That night, the moon was absent, and the darkness felt more profound. I wasn't in the mood to go inside my tent, which I had pitched outside my cabin to have more of a camping vibe. The cool air nipped at my skin as I wandered the trail, the glow of my headlamp slicing through the darkness. The quiet was unnerving. About 20 minutes into my walk, I spotted a dim light ahead. As I walked closer, I saw an elderly man sitting on a boulder by the trail, a lantern casting long shadows across his weathered face. He introduced himself as John, a seasoned hiker who had traversed the Appalachian Trail more times than he could count. We chatted for a few minutes, his gruff but kind demeanor putting me at ease. "You're brave to be out here alone," he said, his voice tinged with concern. "But take my advice, the deeper parts of the trail aren't safe at night. You'd do well to head back to your camp soon." I laughed nervously, brushing off his warning as overcautious. "I'll be fine," I said, thanking him and continuing on my way. Still, his words lingered in my mind, a nagging whisper that grew louder with each step. Not long after leaving John behind, I felt a prickle of unease that started at the base of my neck and spread down my spine. The air seemed heavier, the silence more oppressive. That's when I saw a tall, shadowy figure standing just off the trail, barely illuminated by the faint glow of my headlamp. He wore a green jacket, the hood pulled up, obscuring most of his face. But it was his rigidity, motionless stance, and staring eyes that made me uncomfortable. I tried to walk away, shortening my stride to seem unbothered. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. The figure didn't respond, didn't move. Fear and cortisol surged through me. I quickly turned back toward my camp, my pace quickening with every step. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just another hiker who'd lost his way. But deep down, I knew better. The feeling of being followed hit me about 10 minutes later. It started as a faint crunch of leaves behind me, so subtle I almost dismissed it. But then it grew louder, more deliberate, matching my pace. I glanced over my shoulder and felt my stomach drop. The figure was back, closer now. His green jacket seemed to blend with the shadows, but his intent was clear. He was following me. Panic engulfed me, fear breathing down my neck. I broke into a run, my breaths coming in shallow gasps as I navigated the twisting, unfamiliar paths of the trail. My headlamp bobbed wildly, casting erratic beams of light that only deepened the shadows around me. The footsteps behind me quickened, closing the gap. My mind raced, desperate for a plan, for a way to lose him. Finally, I spotted a massive tree trunk just off the trail, its thick roots curling into the earth like gnarled fingers. I ducked behind it, pressing myself against the rough bark and holding my breath. The footsteps drew nearer, slower now, as if he were searching. I could hear my own heartbeat, a deafening drumbeat in the silence. I peeked around the edge of the trunk and saw him, no more than 10 feet away. His head turned slowly, scanning the darkness. My hands fumbled for something, anything, to defend myself. My fingers closed around a rock, cold and heavy in my palm. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I hurled it as far as I could into the woods. The rock crashed through the underbrush, its noise breaking the stillness like a gunshot. The figure snapped his head toward the sound and started moving in that direction. Seizing the moment, I bolted from my hiding spot, sprinting back toward the main trail with everything I had. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. After what felt like miles, I reached the main trail where other hikers were visible. Immediately, I shouted, waving my arms, and one of them hurried toward me, concern etched across his face. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Someone's following me." I gasped, barely able to get the words out. I collapsed from exhaustion, needing a moment to catch my breath. He helped me up and walked me down the trail until we reached a nearby campsite, where a group of hikers had set up for the night. Safe among them, I finally allowed myself to exhale. I told them everything. "Stay here for tonight, please," one of them requested, and I readily agreed. Tired legs pulled me into sleep quickly, but it was restless. Nightmares woke me up multiple times. Yet, as the sun rose, I felt a sliver of courage return. After thanking my companions, I returned to my cabin with two of them accompanying me. I packed up my belongings, giving them a warm hug before we parted ways. Without their help, I'm not sure what might have happened. As I drove back home, the events of the night replayed in my mind. A few hours had turned my entire perspective upside down, leaving me shaken but grateful to have made it out unscathed. Family trips on the Appalachian Trail could be fun for many, but for us, it was something else entirely. Back in 2020, my husband and I planned a trip to the Appalachian Trail with our two kids. We left for the trip on a Saturday morning and arrived at our campsite in the late afternoon. The area was perfect, with a dense forest and a bright sky. The kids enjoyed it a lot as we arrived. They wandered around the nearby areas, jumping high and expressing their happiness. After setting up camp and roasting marshmallows with the kids, we were ready to settle in for the night. That's when we heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. My husband and I looked at each other. It was strange. We hadn't seen another soul for hours. A white pickup truck rolled into view, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Two men climbed out, each holding a powerful torch that lit up the campsite like a spotlight. They wore green uniforms and wide-brimmed hats, resembling park rangers, but something about their appearance didn't sit right. Their clothes were wrinkled, their boots caked in dry mud, and their badges looked more like cheap replicas than official insignia. "Evening, folks," one of them said, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "We're park rangers, doing our nightly rounds. Just checking in to make sure everyone's safe out here." My husband stepped forward, his tone polite but wary. "Thanks for checking on us. We're just here for a couple of nights. Everything's fine." The second man, who hadn't said much, shone his torch around our campsite, pausing on our gear and supplies. "You picked a pretty remote spot. Not many people come out this far." "That's the idea," I said, forcing a smile. They asked a few more questions, how long we'd be staying, whether we'd seen any wildlife, and if we had a map of the area. Their questions were casual enough, but their presence felt anything but. They lingered, their torches dancing over our belongings as if taking inventory. "All right," the first man finally said. "Just stay safe out here. There have been reports of bears in the area." With that, they climbed back into their truck and drove off, their taillights vanishing into the trees. We stood there in silence for a moment, the hum of the truck's engine fading into the night. "That was odd," my husband finally said. "Do park rangers usually drive pickups like that?" I asked. "Maybe, but they didn't exactly scream official." We tried to shake off the unease and decided to go for a short night walk to calm our nerves. The kids were excited to explore with their flashlights, and I figured the exercise would help tire them out before bed. When we returned to the campsite about an hour later, the scene that greeted us made my stomach drop. Our campsite was in its worst state. The tent flap was unzipped, and its contents spilled out haphazardly. Our cooler was tipped over, its contents scattered across the ground. Footprints crisscrossed the area, larger than any of ours and far too numerous to have been caused by animals.
My husband whispered, ushering the kids behind him.
I scanned the area with my flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. "Do you think it was them?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Who else could it be?" he replied, his jaw clenched. The kids, with fear in their eyes, clung to my legs. "Is it bears, Mommy?" my youngest asked, her voice trembling. "No, sweetheart. It's probably just someone playing a prank," I lied, though my voice betrayed me. We gathered what we could and packed up the gear that hadn't been ruined. Neither of us said it, but we both knew we couldn't stay there another night. In the next moment, we packed the gear and drove home. As we drove down the narrow, winding road, my mind replayed the faces of the two men, their blank expressions, the way they'd inspected our belongings, and the uneasy feeling they'd left behind. On the way, we stopped at the ranger station. My husband and I reported the whole incident. The rangers listened intently, taking notes as we described the men and their truck. But when we asked if they had rangers patrolling the deeper sections of the trail, they shook their heads. "No," one of them said. "We don't send anyone that far out unless there's an emergency." "Why? It's not safe for everyone." "That's why we have posted boards there, advising people not to go further," one of them explained. The realization sent chills down my spine, because we realized that those men were not park rangers. We simply nodded and walked out of the station, sitting back in the car to cover the remaining distance. The kids dozed off soon, but my husband and I kept thinking about who those men were if they weren't rangers. It's been years, but we still haven't found the answers. On social media, we've come across similar incidents, but no one knows their reality. My wife, Emily, and I were, and are, opposites. I like peace, and she loves adventure. I'm open to going to simple, cool places for relaxation, and she always thinks about the forest when we talk about relaxation. That's why, once, she planned a weekend trip to the White Mountain National Forest. I resisted, but she insisted so much that I had to say yes to it. The day started well enough. Emily's excitement was infectious, and I'll admit the views were breathtaking. We hiked for hours, stopping occasionally to admire cascading streams and patches of wildflowers. By the time we returned to our campsite, though, the weather had turned. The air grew colder and ominous. Clouds began to gather overhead. Emily suggested we eat an early dinner and turn in before it started raining. As night settled, we zipped ourselves into the tent. I could hear the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. Emily seemed unusually quiet, and when I turned to check on her, she was shivering. At first, I thought it was just the chill in the air. But then I placed my hand on her forehead. She was burning up. You've got a fever," I said, my voice laced with concern. "It's nothing," she mumbled, trying to wave it off. "It's not nothing. We should pack up and leave." After a bit of back and forth, she reluctantly agreed. I helped her to the car, tucking her into the passenger seat with a blanket. She was pale, her usual spark dimmed, and it made my heart ache. "I'll pack up the tent," I told her. "Just stay here. Lock the doors if you feel unsafe." She nodded, curling up under the blanket. I made my way back to the tent, fumbling in the dark as the wind picked up. I was almost done when I heard the car horn blare. My head snapped up, and I saw Emily frantically waving at me from inside the vehicle. I dropped everything and sprinted toward her. "What's wrong?" I asked, breathless. "I saw something," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Up there, in the trees." "In the trees?" I repeated, glancing in the direction she pointed. All I saw were shadows cast by the swaying branches. I don't know how to describe it," she said. "It moved. Wrong, like it didn't belong." I tried to reassure her, chalking it up to her fever and the dim light playing tricks on her. "Stay in the car," I said firmly. "I'll finish up quickly, and we'll leave." As I returned to the tent, my unease grew. Emily wasn't prone to dramatics, and her fear seemed genuine. I worked as fast as I could, tossing everything into bags without care for organization. Then I heard it. "Daniel!" Emily's voice cut through the still night, panicked and desperate. It was coming from the woods behind me. I froze, my mind racing. She was in the car. I had just left her there. "Daniel," the voice called again, this time closer. I grabbed the flashlight and bolted back to the car, my heart pounding. Emily was exactly where I'd left her, still wrapped in the blanket, her face ashen. "Why are you yelling?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I wasn't," she said, her eyes welling up. Before I could process her words, I heard it again, her voice screaming my name. But this time, it came from behind me, deep in the woods. "Stay in the car," I managed to choke out, though my own fear was suffocating me. I turned toward the forest, the flashlight trembling in my hand. My rational mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe there was someone out there imitating her voice. Maybe. I don't know. "Daniel." The scream came again, but it wasn't quite right this time. It was her voice, but off too high-pitched, too drawn out. I turned back to the car. Emily was crying, begging me to leave everything and just go. The sight of her, so terrified, was enough to snap me out of my paralysis. "Get in the back seat," I said, as calmly as I could. She scrambled over, and I jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the doors shut and locking them. As we sped down the dirt road, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone chasing us. Emily's hands were shaking as she clutched the blanket tighter around herself. When we finally reached the safety of home, Emily told me what she'd seen. While I was at the tent, she had noticed a pale figure crawling through the trees. It wasn't walking or climbing, but moving unnaturally, almost like it was slithering. She said it seemed naked, though the details were hard to make out in the dark. What if it was just a trick of the light? I asked, desperate to find a rational explanation. "It wasn't the light, Daniel," she whispered. "It was real." I couldn't argue with her. Not after hearing her voice in the woods. Not after everything we'd just experienced. We never went back to collect our tent or the gear I'd left behind. Weeks later, I looked up stories about the White Mountain National Forest and found accounts eerily similar to ours, voices calling from the woods, pale figures lurking in the trees. No one had answers, only theories that ranged from wild animals to something far more sinister. All's past. We still go there, but what we ensure is to stay among people. Emily found it a story. She told many, and still tells many people about it, helping them know how to encounter such things. She now leads some campers too, helping them stay there with complete security. Yet, I don't even go out in the forest alone. I love to be here and there with her in the forest all the time. After weeks of effort, I was there on the Appalachian Trail by myself. I had picked the perfect spot after hours of searching, the kind of place that looked like it belonged on a postcard, a clearing near a small stream with tall trees surrounding it, casting long shadows as the evening sun began to set. After setting up my tent and gathering firewood, I cooked myself a simple dinner over the campfire, savoring every bite. There's something about eating outdoors that makes even the simplest meal taste better. I couldn't help but smile, feeling the stress of the past few months start to melt away. With my belly full and the fire crackling, everything was going as planned, peaceful, serene, just how I imagined it. But all of that shattered around 11 p.m. when I had just turned the page of my book and heard the rustling of leaves in the distance. I looked up, seeing the distant shadow, thinking it might be an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Yet, the shadow started getting clearer, and I realized it was a woman. She appeared from the edge of the trees, her figure barely visible in the dim light of the campfire. She was stumbling, her clothes disheveled, and her face was pale. She looked out of place, out of breath, and out of sorts. I stood up, unsure of what to make of the situation. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice carrying into the quiet night. She looked at me with wide, anxious eyes. "Please, help me," she said, her voice shaky. "There's a group of men nearby." They've been following me. I think they're going to hurt me. My first instinct was to invite her to sit near the fire, offer her some safety until she could explain herself. It seemed like the decent thing to do. You can stay by the fire for now. It's safe here, I said, motioning to the campfire. The woman hesitated for a moment, then moved cautiously toward the warmth of the fire. She sat down on the ground, keeping her eyes darting nervously around the camp as if expecting someone to jump out from the shadows. I grabbed a spare blanket and tossed it over to her. Just relax. It'll be okay, I said, trying to reassure her, but something about her nervousness began to unsettle me. She barely seemed to notice the blanket, her focus still on the woods. I need to get out of here. They won't stop until they find me, she said, her voice trembling. Please, can you give me some money? I need to get away from here. It's the only way I can leave. I was shocked. Money? My mind raced as I tried to make sense of the situation. This wasn't the desperate plea for help I had expected. I could feel my gut tighten with unease. I had a feeling this woman wasn't who she said she was. Wait a minute, I said, slowly lowering my voice. What exactly are you talking about? You're asking for money now. You just said you were in danger. Her eyes flashed with something that felt like anger, but there was also something cold about it. She scooted closer to the fire, ignoring my question. I told you, I need to get out of here. Can't you understand that? I need to get away from those men. Something wasn't right. Her story wasn't adding up. I had been around enough people to recognize when someone was lying or trying to manipulate a situation. She had looked scared when she first approached me, but now she seemed too calm. It didn't make sense. I took a step back, my heart rate quickening as suspicion gnawed at me. You're not telling me the truth, are you? I said, my voice shaking slightly with a mixture of anger and fear, while beneath me, my hand was going back, clinging to the pistol that I always carry. You're not in any danger. What do you really want? The woman shot me a defiant look, standing up suddenly. You don't understand. You think I'm lying, but you're wrong. I'm telling you the truth. I stood my ground, shaking my head. No, I don't think you are. And I don't think you're who you say you are. Leave now. The tension in the air thickened as she stared at me. There was anger in her voice and eyes that made my blood run cold. For a split second, I wondered if she would lash out at me, but she didn't. Instead, she muttered something under her breath, her eyes narrowing, and then, as quickly as she had appeared, she turned and started to walk away. I didn't hesitate. I said leave. I shouted, my voice rising with a mix of anger and fear, still hiding my pistol because I wanted to solve the matter without it. The thought of her being out in the dark, lying about her story, made my blood boil. She paused but didn't turn around. You'll regret this, she called over her shoulder before disappearing into the darkness. I stood there for a moment, controlling my confusion and trying to appear as hard as a rock. Yet inside, my heart was still racing, my hands trembling from the encounter. I hadn't wanted to be harsh, but something inside me told me to be firm. I couldn't let her manipulate me or take advantage of my kindness. Thankfully, she was gone, and I was happy that everything was solved without the pistol, because using it always brings another trauma of feeling that you harmed somebody. Later, after her absence, I sat back down by the fire, and I couldn't help but reflect on the situation, trying to process what had just happened. I realized how naive I was to let her come in and sit with me. In the forest, you can never trust anyone, because it's the home of rascals, assholes, and murderers who are looking for prey to catch and hurt them. The next moment, I called a counselor who I knew. I asked him for help. He arrived in 10 minutes. I went with him to his place and stayed there for the night. The next morning, I moved near his place and stayed in the forest for a whole weekend. Very next to next morning, I left for home, realizing how my decision to stay near the counselor made a difference. It made me realize that one bad chapter can never make the whole book bad. Instead, you have the option to make some tweaks and create another good chapter to give yourself memories. Camping with my parents became a trauma for me. Back in 2015, I was only 12 years old when I went with my mom and dad to the Great Smoky Mountains for a weekend camping trip. Like every young girl, I was excited to go there. The first day was awesome. It was the second evening of our stay, and after a hearty dinner around the campfire, my parents told me to go outside and play for a bit while they cleaned up. The sun had just gone down, and the moon was about to come up. I wandered around the edge of the woods, feeling the coolness of the evening air on my skin. It was one of those perfect moments when everything felt right with the world, until it wasn't. I remember hearing the rustling of leaves in the distance, but I paid no mind. It was probably just an animal or the wind. I kept playing, kicking pebbles and making up stories in my head. But then I heard something else, footsteps. They were soft, almost hesitant, but they were getting closer. I turned around and froze. A man had appeared from behind the trees. He looked disheveled, his clothes torn, and his face was unshaven. At first, I thought he might be another camper or hiker, but something about the way he was looking at me made my stomach twist. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, watching me. I could feel his gaze on me, and it made me uncomfortable. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was just lost or trying to find a way through the woods. But then he took a step forward, and my heart began to race. The man sat down under one of the trees near me, his eyes never leaving me. It wasn't a casual glance. It was like he was studying me, his stare cold and unsettling. I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Should I yell for my parents? Before I could make up my mind, the situation escalated in a way I could never have expected. The man began to remove his pants. At first, I thought it was some sort of bizarre mistake. Maybe he was trying to fix them or adjust something, but then it became clear what he was doing. He exposed himself and kept glancing at me, his eyes never wavering from my face. The blood drained from my face, and terror flooded my entire body. I didn't know how to react. Every part of me wanted to scream, but I couldn't find my voice. All I could think about was getting away from him, away from whatever was happening. Finally, the terror broke through. I opened my mouth and screamed as loudly as I could, my voice shaking with fear. I turned and ran back toward the camp, not even looking behind me to see if he was following. I was too afraid to look, too afraid that he might be right behind me, ready to do something worse. When I burst into the camp, my parents were still sitting by the fire, talking and laughing. I didn't stop to explain. I just grabbed my dad's arm and pulled him toward me. I could barely get the words out. There's a man. Hey, he was staring at me, and he. But my father understood immediately. His face turned from confusion to anger in an instant. Stay here, he told me sharply. I'm going to find him. I watched, my heart pounding in my chest as my dad rushed off toward the woods, calling out for the man. My mom was at my side in an instant, pulling me into her arms and trying to calm me down. But there was no calming down. My whole body was shaking, my mind racing through 1,000 thoughts at once. What if my dad didn't find him? What if he hurt someone else? What if I was too late to stop it? It felt like hours before my dad returned, but in reality, it was only a few minutes. He was out of breath, his face red with anger. I found him, he said, and I called the police. They'll be here soon. I could see the rage in my dad's eyes. There was also a sense of relief. The man had fled the moment my dad started looking for him, but not before my dad got a good look at his face. The police arrived shortly after and arrested the man right there in the woods. I didn't know all the details, but knew that he would be facing charges for what he had done. Even after everything settled down, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The memory of that man's eyes, the way he stared at me, stayed with me long after the police left, and we packed up to go home. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to something terrible happening. How my parents had protected me, but how easily things could have turned out differently. As years went by, that night stayed with me. It wasn't just fear of that man that haunted me. It was realizing that there are people in this world who will do things without a second thought. People who take advantage of innocence without any remorse. For a long time, I struggled to talk about it. It was one of those things you don't ever want to relive or share with others. It's been years since then, yet it shaped me into who I am now. I work with organizations to create awareness about good and bad touch. Recently, I've worked with rangers to ensure young girls' safety and am part of an all-women campers group where we take girls camping and ensure their security.